Hi, it's Mary Beth Martin. I'm back to continue reading with you Willa of the Wood. I have picked up my copy here and I'm ready to get started back at chapter 21 where we left off last time. We were waiting to find out if some of Willa's Jader friends might really know what was in her satchel or not. So let's turn there in my copy. It starts on page 108. So let's get started reading. Gredick studied her with his narrow eyes, his face contorting as he grappled with her question. He looked at the deflated bag, then back at her. "It's empty," he said. "There's nothing left of value in there." "Gredick is right," Willa said loudly, nodding as she looked around at the faces in the crowd. And then she turned and looked at the Pataran. "He's right. What is left in the bag is of little monetary value, certainly no value at all to him. It's a personal gift from me to the Pataran to thank him for all he's done for me and for our people." Well, everyone watched as Willa reached her hand into the bag and pulled out a small pouch of brown material. She bowed her head in a gesture of honor and handed the Pataran the chewing tobacco she had stolen from the lair of the Dayfolk man. She knew that the tobacco that the humans used was one of the Pataran's most private and beloved pleasures. The Pataran's shoulders rolled with seething anticipation as he pulled the tobacco into his covetous hands. Not just because he was pleased with her gift or because her words had touched his heart, but because he loved the conniving way she had tricked her rivals. He was the god of the clan, but she knew deep down he would suck delight from the thought that she had learned the power of deceit from him. And the truth was, she had. She'd been watching him all her life, learning how to gain his smiles and avoid his strikes, how to not just persevere, but to prevail in the world he'd created. "This is a very good take, Willa," he said, using her name in the most powerful way. Gredick and the other Jaders exploded in contempt, hissing and snarling. They swayed their body and gnashed their sharp little teeth. Despite all the wrongs she'd done against the clan, she had once again shifted her colors and slipped away. She was the mouse that always squirmed out of their grasp, and the Jaders knew that her words to the Pataran were all part of her trickery. They were the loyal ones, not her. And worst of all, Gredick and Cedric and Kiernan and the others that knew Gredick's time as the leader of the Jaders was waning. But Willa, despite all her victories, couldn't feel the glory of her moment the way she thought she would. Deep down, the actions she performed and the words she said left her cold and empty. She had brought her satchel home fuller than it had ever been. She was surrounded by her clan and praised by the Pataran. This was what she had always wanted. But the only thing she could think of, the only sensation she wanted to feel, was the friendship of the wolves, the acceptance of the bears, and the sight of the glistening lake. And then, to her surprise, she thought about what the human boy had called cookies. Those particular little lumps she had passed through the mesh of the prison cell, for some reason it felt like that, helping the human boy trapped in the dark prison of her clan. That strange and dangerous thing that came from the I deep inside her instead of the we of the clan had been her most satisfying reward for coming home with her satchel full. Her mind kept returning to one thing, the way the man with his killing stick had looked at her when he found her wounded in his barn. She remembered the way he had spoken to her in soft tones and found a cloth to tend to her wound. All the other thoughts slipped away into a murky, muddled nothingness. But that one act of kindness dwelled in her mind and her heart like nothing had before. As the Jaders jeered at her, the Pataran looked upon her, and the rest of the clan watched it all. Willa turned to her grandmother at the edge of the room. Her grandmother's eyes were looking at her, holding on to Willa with everything she could. But her mama's eyes weren't filled with pride or happiness or even relief in her accomplishments. They were filled with worry. It seemed as if her mama was thinking, "You're blending in a way that I never taught you, but it's keeping us both alive." When Willa turned back to look at the Patarian, she was startled to see that he wasn't looking at the crowd like that he normally did, or even at her, but across the room at her grandmother. Willa knew that her grandmother had lived a quiet, peaceful life for many years, blending into the rest of the clan, nurturing the plants in her den, and raising her granddaughter. But now the Patarian's eyes were studying her grandmother as if he was wondering just what kind of trickery the old woman had brought into his hall. Then he turned slowly back towards Willa. "Come here, Willa," he ordered, his tone filled with a commanding tone that turned her blood ice cold. With those simple, blunt words, the room went silent, Willa's chest tightening. Having no other choice, she stepped towards the looming presence of the great leader. "I want you to tell me where you got this take," he said. "I stole it, my Patarian," she said, trying to sound proud, but her voice was trembling. It was the truth. She knew she should be proud of it in his eyes. He had been the one who taught her how to steal, how to deceive. But she felt the heat rising to her cheeks. He had seen something. He had sensed something. "Where did you steal it?" he asked. Knowing that it would anger him if he knew she had risked creeping into a homesteader's lair, she didn't answer. "Where did you get all this, Willa?" The Patarian knew she didn't want to divulge her secrets to her Jader rivals, but he pressed her anyway. He seemed to sense that she'd done or seen something out there in the world that had changed her in some way. When he stepped closer to her, a drop of sweat dripped from his face and fell into her hair. He was so close that she could smell the musk of his body. She desperately wanted to shrink away from him, but she knew she couldn't. He leaned his face to her neck and sniffed. "What is that I smell on you?" he asked her. "Nothing, my Patarian," she said, quickly as she could. "Have you been touching some sort of—" He paused and tilted his head and sniffed again. "Some sort of animal? What kind of animal is that I smell?" "Nothing, my Patarian," she said again. He clamped onto her shoulder with a crushing hand. "You will come with me." The Patarian had commanded it, so Willa had no choice but to follow him. The god of the clan pulled her behind the throne and through a woven stick archway that led into a narrow passage. She tried to wipe down the quills on the back of her neck with the cup of her hand, worrying that they'd betray the increasing sense of dread churning through her body. Still carrying the spear of power, the Patarian led her into the inner sanctuary of his private den, a heavily protected part of the lair that she and the other members of the clan were never allowed to enter. It was a great honor, but she couldn't help but realize that she wasn't being invited. She was being brought by force. Every instinct in her body was telling her to run, to get away from him. But the Patarian walked fast and hard, pulling her along with the dark and invisible force of his will. Two guards pushed her from behind with their sharpened spears pointed at her back. One of them, a Lorcan, the commander of the Patarian's guards. Lorcan was the tallest Farron guard she had ever seen, with long, gangly arms and legs. He had a mash of hair the color of rotting twigs, a high forehead like a jutting boulder, and black, bulging eyes. He'd been serving the Patarian since long before she was born. Wedged between the Patarian ahead of her and the two guards behind her, she climbed her way up the narrow, winding, woven stick tunnel, which was so tight that the Patarian's shoulders scraped the walls, and so steep that her calves burned. When they finally reached the room at the top, she gasped at what she saw. The room glowed with the orange, blazing light of many burning torches. And it was stacked from floor to ceiling with hundreds of dayfolk objects, from the tools she'd seen in homesteaders' barns to strange mechanical instruments of all shapes and sizes. She had no idea what all these bewildering things were for or why they were here. She had always thought the Patarians sold and traded their takes to the dayfolk for food and other necessities for the clan. But now she saw that he had been acquiring these objects year after year, hiding them all this time. If we are going to survive, the Patarian said, then we must understand the tools and weapons of our enemy. She reached towards a complicated-looking brass device with spoked metal circles and many levers, dials, and thumbscrews. The newcomers use it to look at the terrain of the earth and plan out the paths of the roads they build, he said. Humans do not seem to be able to understand the world or even find their way through it until they have measured it and marked it on their maps. As he spoke, the Patarian's long clawed fingers caressed the device's wheels and knobs possessively. He did not appear to know how to use the machine, but he held it as if he owned and controlled its inner power. Then the Patarian walked over to a collection of hammers, spikes, and other iron accoutrements. The clanging men used these to lay down the long steel rails that the steaming beasts follow into the forest, he said, picking up one of the iron spikes. This is the future, he declared, looking at the metal object with true reverence in his eyes. It was hard not to let his confidence and his knowledge of the outside world draw her in, but she didn't understand. Did he mean that the future belonged to those who controlled the metal? Or that more of these things he called the steaming beasts were coming? Or that iron was the direction he was going to take the Dead Hollow clan? Or that the spike itself possessed some sort of magical power? But the most disturbing thing was that she wasn't even sure he knew the answer. He seemed convinced that the power of the humans lay in these strange metal objects, but he didn't seem to truly understand the purpose of the devices or how to use most of them. It was as if he thought that by simply possessing them or being near them, he would somehow gain their power. She had watched the Patarian all her life. He was the closest thing she had to a father. He'd always been a strong and forceful leader in the clan, someone she looked up to, someone she feared. But it seemed as if he had spent countless hours in this room, holding these objects in his hand, studying them, trying to divine their hidden secrets. They had become a festering obsession in his mind. When her eyes were drawn to a long, gleaming brass tube mounted on a three-legged stick, he said, "Step forward and look through it." It appeared to be one of the few devices he had actually figured out how to use. She studied the contraption uncertainly, wondering if its purpose was to rip out little girls' eyeballs when they went against the will of the clan. Seeing her timidness, he put his hand on the device to steady it, to hold it in his control, as if to make it clear that only through him was it safe for her to use. Quieting her breath as the best she could, she stepped closer, leaning slowly forward and put her eye up to the end of the long tube. When she blinked, the flash of her eyelash startled her so severely that she leapt back in surprise. "Now, conquer your fear and try again. Close your left eye and look through with your right." As she leaned forward, she squinted her eye one way and then the other until she began to see light coming through the tube. Then she caught a glimpse of several Farrens standing together talking among themselves. She pulled back in astonishment. There were no such people in the room, and yet she saw them quite clearly. "The humans call this a telescope," he said, showing her a small opening in the wall through which the tube was pointed. When she peered through the hole, Willa saw the Farren gathering in the hall of the Patarian, far below them like bees in a crowded hive. From this vantage point, the Patarian could spy on all the Farren in the great hall, but other uses for the device immediately sprang into her mind as well. Watching her, the Patarian asked, "Do you understand the device's power?" "Yes," she said excitedly. "If you took it to the top of the great mountain and pointed it outward, you could see the edge of the world." The Patarian's eyes widened ever so slightly. She could see that it wasn't an idea that had occurred to him. "Now, follow me," he said, dragging her by the arm as the two guards followed close behind them. As they left the Pataran's horde of human-made objects behind them, they crossed through a series of dark, empty rooms with crumbling ceilings and disintegrating walls. One room interconnected to the other, a vast hive of hundreds of abandoned Farron den. The murky world of the hollow, dripping rooms had once been the most luxurious chambers of the Farron of old, but they had come to stink of black and seeping mold. When she glanced behind her, the guards seemed just as anxious to leave this decaying place as she was. The Pataran moved quickly through the abandoned den, intent on reaching some distant point on the other side. Finally, they came to an area where the walls of the rooms and corridors were mostly still intact, and a little bit of light filtered down through small holes in the woven stick ceiling. They crossed through a den that looked different from any Farron room she had ever seen, clean and dry. It was adorned with human furniture, a table, a chair, a mirror, a wax candle holder, a small decorative box for holding tobacco, even pillows and woolen blankets. It startled Willa to see what looked like a human's bedroom inside the layer of dead hollow. But the room didn't smell of humans, it smelled like the Pataran. It was the Pataran's private den. But what astounded her was that there wasn't a cocoon of woven reeds like her and the other Farron slept in. The Pataran appeared to sleep in a large, woven dayfolk bed. "Come this way," he said, pulling her through the room and into the next. They reached a narrow passage and went up a winding tunnel towards what smelled like fresh air. But Willa's mind couldn't let go of what she had just seen. The Pataran's collection of dayfolk objects? The human bed in his den? Why does he think I won't tell anyone what I'm seeing here, she wondered. Where is he taking me? Knowing brings death. Her grandmother's words slipped into her thoughts. The Pataran pushed open a woven stick door with a steel spear and pulled her outside into a dense and secluded area of forest. Lorcan and the other guard came up close behind her with the spears as the Pataran led her along a narrow trail crowded with the bent and twisted limbs of blackened trees. Looking around her, Willa could see that they had come out somewhere on the upper side of the great mountain, just above the lair, but she'd never been in this area of the forest before. On both sides of the path, she saw what looked like white bones and rotting brown heaps lying in the leaves. A sickening feeling crept into Willa's stomach. Why are they taking me here, she thought, and why is the Pataran still carrying his spear? Back in my rooms, you saw the machines of humans, the Pataran said as they walked. Yes, my Pataran, she said, glancing behind her at Lorcan and the other guard, wondering if she could outrun them. Her chest started pulling more air into her lungs, getting her ready. And you understand who I am, the Pataran said. You're the sacred leader of our clan, my Pataran, she said, as her eyes scanned the forest around them. Her skin was beginning to crawl. The truth was she had no idea who he was, where he came from, or how he had come to wield such dominion over the clan. You see, now that I can give you anything you can imagine from the dayfolk world, he said. Yes, my Pataran, she said, her throat feeling tighter and tighter. She had no idea why she would want something from the dayfolk world, but this appeared to be an offer of great significance to him, intended to impress her and draw her in. And I can give you more power in the clan than you ever imagined possible. Yes, my Pataran, she said, the muscles in her legs beginning to twitch. If Gredic and the others are bothering you, then I can eliminate them, get them out of your way. Yes, my Pataran, she said, her breaths getting shorter, but this was something she understood. If I wish, I can make you the leader of the Jaders. Yes, my Pataran, she said, but why are you telling her this here in the middle of the forest? Finally, the Pataran stopped. When he turned and peered into her eyes, she couldn't help but shrink back from the long, sharp tip of his steel spear. With his voice low and menacing, he said, But if you lie to me, Willa, if you try to deceive me in any way, No, my Patarian, I wouldn't do that, she said, trying to back up, but feeling the point of Lorcan's spear against her spine. If you try to go against me, then I will hurt you, the Patarian said. And I'll hurt everything you love, do you understand? I haven't been going against you, my Patarian, she said, her voice shaking. Do you know why I've brought you out here? He asked. We will stop there at the end of chapter 22 today. I thank you for tuning in and reading along with me in Willa of the Wood.